The year 686 saw the birth of one of Europe's most important military leaders. This is the year Charles Martel, the legendary mayor of Francia, was conceived. From almost day one, Charles was at the forefront of European power. At the time, the Frankish kingdom was politically fragmented into numerous province-like states, each ruled by their own mayors. Although these mayors were still technically subject to the king of Francia, his power had significantly diminished over the years. This led the mayors to exercise complete power over their domains, as if entirely independent from the king. Charles's father, Pepin of Herstal, was mayor of the kingdoms of Neustria and Austrasia, in modern-day France and Belgium. His father was most famous for declaring himself Prince of the Franks, and by his conquest of the Frankish domains. When the question of who would be Pepin's heir arose, the mayor chose his grandson, Theodald, who was only 6 years old at the time, to be his heir. His decision was due in part to the influence of Plectrude, Theodald's mother, but also the fact that Charles was technically Pepin's illegitimate son. In order to protect Theodald's claim to the throne, Charles was imprisoned. But after escaping from confinement, Charles managed to gain support from the nobles of Cologne, who then declared him mayor of Austrasia. After becoming mayor, Charles's focus was now on the neighboring kingdom of Neustria, whose self-proclaimed mayor, Ragenfrid, was on the march to meet Charles with his army. In an excellent display of might and tactics, Charles and his men defeated their rivals at the battles of Amblève, Vincy, and finally the Battle of Soissons, which confirmed Charles's influence over Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Not only did these victories cement Charles's reign as the sole ruler over the Franks, but also made him the most powerful man in Europe. But Charles's problems were far from over. In the following years of his reign, he would come face to face with the greatest threat to European sovereignty since the Roman Empire, the Great Umayyad Caliphate. Ever since its beginnings in 661, the Islamic Caliphate had rapidly expanded its territories across the Middle East and North Africa. The jihadists believed they were fulfilling their divine duty to the wishes of their prophet Muhammad. By 711, the Muslims had entered the Spanish peninsula and easily defeated their Visigothic foes at the Battle of Guadalete. Less than a decade later, the empire had reached the border of southern France. With the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, the Umayyads now threatened to invade Europe beyond the Pyrenees Mountains. After the fall of the Visigothic capital at Narbonne, the jihadists turned their attention to the Frankish lands, starting with small-scale raids into Aquitaine and eventually reaching as far as Burgundy. However, it was not until 730 that these invasions would become full-scale military campaigns. It was the new Islamic commander, Abdul al-Rahman Ghafiqi, that took these invasions a step further. After Duke Odo of Aquitaine successfully repelled an Islamic advance in Narbonne in 721, Rahman took it upon himself to retaliate against the mayor. In 730, he conjured up his army and marched his forces into Aquitaine from the western end of the Pyrenees. It is worth mentioning that due to a weak supply line, Rahman's army was forced to raid wherever possible in order to feed his men. Needless to say, the towns and cities that fell in his way were completely sacked of everything, a dreadful factor to anyone standing in their way. Fearing a similar fate to his capital at Bordeaux, Duke Odo brought what forces he could to meet Rahman's army outside the city walls. But Odo's attempt to save his city were all in vain. His troops were swiftly crushed and he was forced to retreat. After his humbling defeat, Odo sought help from his former rival, Charles Martel. Charles was perhaps the only man in Europe at the time capable of fending off the Islamic onslaught. Charles realized this and so readily made an alliance with Odo. As was expected, the Umayyads didn't stop at Bordeaux and continued their campaign through Aquitaine, pillaging as they went. In response, Charles marched his army to the cities of Tours and Poitiers to try to stop the Muslims before they reached the highly esteemed riches of the Abbey of St. Martin. By October, Abdul Rahman's force faced Charles Martel and his men. The inevitable battle would ultimately decide the fate of Western Christendom. All this rested on the shoulders of one man, Charles Martel. Before we discuss the ensuing battle, we're going to address the advantages that Charles Martel held that would ultimately determine the victor. First of all, Charles's army was unlike that of any other European army for the time. Ever since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, professional long-standing armies were virtually non-existent. Instead, European kingdoms usually recruited their armies when the time arose and then disbanded them after the conflict was resolved. This lack of standing armies left soldiers untrained and unprofessional, an unpleasant fact if they wished to repel a Muslim invasion. However, it was Charles that broke this norm, reforming his army into a permanent professional unit, battle-hardened from years of his various campaigns. His military reforms went a step further by increasing the role of heavy cavalry. To add to these advantages, the jihadist invaders were completely unaware about Charles's well-trained force. Ever since encountering the Visigoths in Spain, the Umayyads regarded European armies as easy opponents. Never before in Europe had they come up against a force like Charles Martel's, nor did they have any reason to anticipate one. The battle commenced on October 10, 732. The Islamic force, consisting of mostly cavalry, led the charge into the Christian infantry forces. Normally, a force of cavalry would have easily plowed through such a force, but Martel, being the tactician that he was, had placed his troops on an elevated hill between the Clain and Vienne rivers. This strategic position enabled Charles's professional soldiers to easily fend off the cavalry. One Arabian chronicler described Martel's soldiers. Firmly they stood, one close to another, forming as it were a bulwark of ice, and with great blows of their swords they hewed down the Arabs. After several days of on and off conflict, the Franks managed to gain the upper hand in a dramatic climax of events. When Rahman and his cavalry attempted another assault against the Franks, Charles sent forth a small contingent of his men to sneak into the enemy's camp. Upon hearing the news, many of the Islamic horsemen broke their ranks in a desperate attempt to save the loot they had gained from the campaign. Seizing the opportunity, Charles ordered his reserves forward to surround the remaining Muslims. Cut off from retreat, the Islamists were quickly slain down, including El-Rahman himself. In a panic, the Muslims that could escaped back to their camp, and by dawn the next day, the Franks had found the camp completely abandoned. The battle was over, and Charles Martel had come out the victor. It is from here on that Charles was given the title and last name, Martel, which translates to the Hammer. Following the battle, the Umayyads retreated back to Iberia, where they had come. Although small incursions were attempted into France afterwards, never again did an Islamic force like Al-Rahman's threaten to invade Europe. The spread of Islam had been halted, allowing Western Christendom to thrive on. The accomplishments and legacies that Charles Martel left behind are many, so much so that to list every single one of them is next to impossible. However, there are a few that stick out better than most. First of all, his decisive role in winning the Battle of Tours firmly put an end to Islamic advances into Europe. If not for his actions, the Umayyads would have easily overrun the kingdoms of Europe, who, for the exception of Martel, were weak and vulnerable. For this, he can be credited for saving Western Christianity from the onslaught of Islam. He is also noted for his military reforms. As I mentioned earlier, Martel revolutionized how European armies operated by professionalizing them. It's important to note that these military reforms set the basis for feudalism in the coming centuries. And lastly, Charles started the Carolingian dynasty, one of history's most important noble bloodlines, whose members included Charles's grandson, the Great Charlemagne, another one of history's important figures. After years of heavy campaigning and ruling his kingdom, Charles Martel was finally laid to rest on October 22nd, 741. But the impacts of this legendary leader will live on, making him of utmost importance to understanding how the modern world was shaped.